Professor Quixx floated into the lecture hall of the Galactic Academy of Higher Sciences, his gelatinous form pulsating with what his students recognized as smugness. 6 tentacle-like appendages extended from his translucent body, each holding a different teaching aid. But today, one appendage clutched something new, a small, metallic cube that gleamed under the artificial lighting. "Good rotation cycle to you all," Professor Quixx announced, his voice modulator adjusting to the perfect frequency for the 17 different species present in the auditorium. "Today marks the beginning of your final assessment in advanced problem-solving methodologies." A collective groan echoed through the hall, emanating from various respiratory organs and communication appendages. Professor Quixx was infamous throughout the prestigious Galactic Academy for his impossible tests, designed specifically to humble even the most brilliant minds in the galaxy. "Silence," he commanded, the fluid inside his body turning a deep purple with authority. "This challenge separates the truly exceptional from the merely adequate. In my 427 cycles of teaching, only 3 students have ever passed this test." The professor's primary visual organ swiveled across the room, stopping briefly on a figure in the back row. The only human in the class, perhaps the only human in the entire academy this cycle, sat quietly, her dark eyes fixed on the metallic cube. "Ah, Ms. Washington," Professor Quixx's voice dripped with condescension. "Our exchange student from that curious little blue planet. Perhaps you'd like to observe from the sidelines? This challenge might be beyond the capabilities of your less evolved species." Ellie Washington straightened in her seat, her expression neutral despite the thinly veiled insult. At 26 Earth years, she was considered practically an infant by most galactic standards, yet here she was, competing with beings whose civilizations had mastered interstellar travel while humans were still figuring out agriculture. "I'll participate, Professor," she replied evenly. "That's why I'm here." Professor Quixx's body rippled in what might have been amusement. "Very well. The challenge is simple to explain, yet nearly impossible to execute." He placed the metallic cube on the central platform where it hovered in the gravity field. "This is a Bolterian puzzle container, created by the finest minds of the 7th quadrant. Your task is to open it." The container rotated slowly, about 15 centimeters on each side, its surface a seamless metallic sheen without any visible openings, buttons, or seams. "You will have exactly 7 standard rotations to complete this task. No tools are permitted, only your intellect and the physical capabilities you were born with." His fluid form rippled again. "Begin." The classroom erupted into activity. Graxus, the 8-limbed Ventulian, immediately extended his telepathic feelers toward the box, attempting to sense its internal mechanism. Nearby, T-Pella, a silicon-based Aldebaran, began analyzing the container's molecular structure with her crystalline sensory nodes. Ellie watched as one by one, her classmates approached the challenge with their unique biological advantages. Photosensitive appendages, ultrasonic emissions, magnetic field generators grown naturally from evolved organs. The diversity of attempts was impressive. Yet after 2 hours, the container remained stubbornly sealed. "Fascinating, isn't it?" Professor Quixx oozed beside Ellie, who had yet to approach the platform. "The most advanced life forms in the galaxy, stumped by a simple box. What exactly are you waiting for, Ms. Washington?" Ellie's eyes hadn't left the container. "I'm observing, Professor." "Observing failure?" He chuckled, the sound gurgling through his translation device. "Observing patterns," she corrected. "Everyone's trying to outsmart the box, using advanced biological adaptations or mental powers. But nobody's trying to understand it." Professor Quixx's primary visual organ dilated with interest. "And you believe you can understand what the collective intelligence of this classroom cannot?" Ellie finally stood, her movement drawing curious gazes from her frustrated classmates. Sometimes the simplest solution is the one overlooked by the most complex minds. As she approached the platform, Ellie's mind cataloged what she'd observed, the subtle color shifts in the metal when Zondar's heat vision had focused on one corner, the barely perceptible vibration when Melix had generated a low-frequency hum, the momentary weight shift when the gravity field had fluctuated during the Flobian twins' attempt. The container wasn't responding to telepathy, molecular restructuring, or quantum phasing, all capabilities far beyond human biology. But it had responded, however minutely, to something much more basic. Professor Quixx hovered nearby, his body now a pale yellow of curiosity as he watched the human circling the platform. Her five-fingered hands, so primitive compared to most species here, clasped behind her back. "Your time is running short, Ms. Washington," he reminded her. "Perhaps on Earth, problems solve themselves while humans watch." Ellie smiled for the first time since class began. "Not quite, Professor. But sometimes we see solutions where others see only impossibilities." She hadn't touched the box yet, but she'd begun to understand it. And in that understanding lay the path that 17 advanced species had overlooked entirely. Day 2 of the challenge dawned with a palpable tension in the air. Students entered the lecture hall with drooping appendages and dimmed bioluminescent patches, universal signs of academic despair across species. The container still sat mockingly in the center of the room, unchanged and unopened. Ellie arrived early, carrying nothing but a small, insulated flask. Unlike her classmates who brought increasingly complex scanning devices and probability calculators, she seemed almost casual. Professor Quixx noticed this immediately. "Ms. Washington," he bubbled, floating toward her workstation. "I see you've come prepared with a beverage container?" His translator couldn't quite convey the mixture of amusement and condescension in his tone. "Just some hot tea, Professor," Ellie replied, taking a sip. "Helps me think." Before attending the Galactic Academy, Ellie had spent 6 years working for Earth's Deep Space Engineering Corps. Her specialty wasn't theoretical physics or quantum mechanics, it was making things work when they broke down millions of kilometers from the nearest repair shop. Where her alien classmates had grown up with matter manipulators and neural interfaces, Ellie had learned to fix oxygen scrubbers with duct tape and paper clips. As the room filled, Ellie watched Graxus attach what appeared to be miniature gravitational wave detectors to his cranial nodes. Nearby, the Flobian twins were constructing an elaborate probability field generator that hummed with energy. T-Pella had somehow grown additional crystalline sensory structures overnight, specifically calibrated to analyze the container's composition. "Your fellow students have dedicated considerable resources to this challenge," Professor Quixx commented, hovering beside Ellie. "Yet you appear to be contemplating your beverage." Ellie smiled. "I'm thinking about my grandfather, actually." "Is this a human ritual before problem solving? Ancestral meditation?" The professor's body rippled with genuine curiosity. "Sort of. My grandfather was a plumber on Earth. Fixed pipes, heating systems, that sort of thing." Ellie's eyes never left the container as she spoke. "He used to take me on jobs when I was a kid. Taught me that understanding how things respond to basic forces tells you more than any fancy equipment ever could." The professor's primary visual organ dilated slightly. A pipe maintainer. And what wisdom could such a profession impart that would be relevant at the Galactic Academy? Ellie remembered those summer days in her grandfather's rusty truck, driving between jobs in the sweltering Texas heat. He'd say, "Ellie girl, everything in the universe follows the same basic rules. Heat makes things expand. Cold makes EM contract. Pressure builds up and needs release. Understand those simple truths, and you'll never be stumped for long." Across the room, a frustrated cry erupted as Melix's sound wave resonator overloaded, sending a harmless but startling shock through his tentacles. Other students were showing similar signs of frustration. Zondar's heat vision had increased to dangerous levels, requiring emergency cooling measures, while T-Pella's newly grown crystals were beginning to crack under the strain of continuous analysis. "Fascinating approach, relying on ancestral anecdotes," Professor Quixx said, but his tone had shifted from condescension to something approaching genuine interest. And have you formed any hypotheses based on these simple truths? Ellie finally turned to face him. I have, Professor. That container isn't responding to mental powers or advanced technology because it wasn't designed to. I think it's much more basic than that. The professor's gelatinous form stilled completely a sign of intense focus among his species. Explain. Yesterday, I noticed subtle responses to physical stimuli: temperature, vibration, pressure. Not enough for anyone to notice if they were looking for quantum fluctuations or telepathic responses. Ellie stood up. May I approach the container now? By this point, several other students had noticed the conversation and were watching with a mixture of exhaustion and skepticism. Zondar's three-eyed stalk swiveled toward them. The human thinks she can solve it, he snorted through his thermal vents. Perhaps she'll ask it nicely to open. T-Pella's crystalline form shimmered with what might have been laughter. My molecular analysis indicates the container is composed of a triphasic alloy unknown to primitive Earth science. No offense, Washington, but your species hasn't even mastered basic molecular restructuring. Professor Quixx raised an appendage for silence. Let us observe Ms. Washington's approach. If nothing else, it will serve as an educational contrast to your more advanced methodologies. As Ellie walked toward the container, flask in hand, the class fell into a curious hush. Even those who had been ignoring her paused their work to watch. The human, the evolutionary newcomer from a planet that had only achieved spaceflight within the last century, approaching a puzzle that had stumped species with million-year head starts. This should be amusing, whispered Graxis to his lab partner. What's she going to do? Hit it with a rock? Ellie set her flask down beside the container and placed her hands on her hips, studying the metallic cube one last time. The subtle imperfections she'd noticed yesterday were still there, nearly invisible to the naked eye, but present. The faint discoloration on one corner, the barely perceptible seam along one edge, the slight difference in surface texture on opposing sides. Professor, she said, her voice steady as she reached for her flask, may I demonstrate what I believe is the solution? Professor Quixx's body had turned a deep shade of blue, the color of academic intrigue among his species. By all means, Ms. Washington, the floor is yours. The entire lecture hall fell silent as Ellie unscrewed her flask. Steam rose from the opening, carrying the earthy aroma of her tea into the carefully controlled atmosphere of the classroom. Without explanation, she set the flask down and turned to address the professor. The container responds to physical properties, not technological interfaces or mental commands, she explained. I believe it's designed to test understanding of basic universal principles, not advanced capabilities. Professor Quixx's gelatinous form rippled with skepticism. A bold claim. Please demonstrate. Ellie nodded and carefully poured a small amount of hot tea onto the top surface of the container. The liquid spread across the metallic surface, steam rising as it made contact. What is she doing? Hissed Zondar to T-Pella. Performing some primitive Earth ritual? Ellie ignored the commentary, watching intently as the hot liquid covered the surface. Then, reaching into her pocket, she pulled out a small cloth handkerchief. Yesterday I noticed something when Zondar used his heat vision on this corner, she said, pointing to the upper right edge of the cube. There was a subtle color change, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. She wiped away the tea, then reached for a small ice cube that had been floating in her drink. Holding it between her fingers, she applied it to the exact same corner she'd just heated. The color change was actually thermal response, she continued. When heated and then rapidly cooled, the molecular structure shifts temporarily. As if responding to her words, a faint line appeared along the edge of the cube where she'd applied the ice. Professor Quixx's primary visual organ dilated to its maximum width. Fascinating, he murmured, his translator barely catching the word. Ellie methodically repeated the process on each corner of the top face hot tea, followed by the ice cube. With each application, more lines appeared, creating a visible pattern across the surface. "It's responding to thermal expansion and contraction," she explained. "Heat causes the molecular bonds to expand, cold forces them to contract rapidly. The stress creates microfractures along predetermined fault lines." The memory surfaced unbidden her grandfather's workshop back in Houston, a stubborn pipe fitting that wouldn't budge. "Watch this. Ellie girl," he'd said, applying a blowtorch to the metal, then a damp cloth. The resulting contraction had broken the corrosion's hold, allowing him to unscrew the fitting with ease. "Sometimes the most elegant solutions are the simplest ones," he'd told her, winking. "Nature's rules apply everywhere, from Earth to the edge of the universe." In the present, Graxus had abandoned his equipment and moved closer, his 8 eyes blinking in sequence, a sign of intense concentration among Ventulians. "But that's just basic thermodynamics," he said, his telepathic translator conveying genuine surprise. "Not even advanced applications, just elementary physics." "Exactly," Ellie replied, continuing her work. By now, a clear grid pattern had emerged on the top face of the container. The most fundamental principles of the universe, applied with precision. The Flobian twins exchanged glances through their compound eyes. "We were attempting to create a probability field to predict the unlocking mechanism," one admitted, when the mechanism was already there, built into the physical properties of the material itself. Professor Quixx had moved so close to the demonstration that his gelatinous form was almost touching the container. His body had shifted from blue to an iridescent gold, a color Ellie had never seen him display before. "It continue, Ms. Washington," he urged, his voice modulator conveying genuine excitement. Ellie turned the cube carefully to access another face. "The trick is the sequence," she explained, applying heat and cold to specific points on the new surface. "It's like a combination lock, but instead of numbers, it uses thermal stress points." As she worked, more students abandoned their complex equipment to gather around her demonstration. The skepticism on their various alien faces had transformed into something new: curiosity, and perhaps a reluctant respect. Ellie thought again of Earth, of the time she'd repaired a malfunctioning airlock on the Luna base, using nothing but controlled temperature applications to realign the warped seal. Her superior officers had been preparing to order expensive replacement parts when she'd solved the problem with a heating element and compressed CO2 canister. "Advanced technology is wonderful," she said, more to herself than the audience, "but understanding fundamental principles means you're never helpless, even when technology fails." A soft click echoed through the room as a portion of the container's top face shifted slightly upward. A collective gasp rose from the gathered students. "It's opening," T-Pella exclaimed, her crystalline form vibrating with excitement. "Not quite yet," Ellie cautioned, carefully continuing her pattern. "This is just the first phase. The container has multiple locking mechanisms, each responding to different physical properties." She reached again for her tea, now cooler but still warm, and poured a careful stream around the raised portion of the surface. The liquid seeped into the newly exposed gap, disappearing into the interior of the container. "Now we need pressure differential," she explained, placing her palm over the gap and pressing down gently. Another click, louder this time. Professor Quixx's body had become nearly transparent with excitement, a rare state that, according to xenobiology texts, indicated profound academic revelation among his species. Pressure, temperature, and now Ellie looked up, meeting the professor's gaze. Time. The container emitted a soft humming sound as the top section rose further, revealing a complex series of internal chambers and channels. The class watched, transfixed, as a thin line of liquid Ellie's tea traveled through these passages, propelled by the pressure she had applied and the capillary action of the narrow channels. "The final key is patience," she said quietly. "Some processes can't be rushed." As the liquid reached various points within the visible mechanism, small gears and levers began to move in sequence. The container was awakening, responding to the simple physics of its design rather than the advanced technologies that had been brought to bear against it. The top panel of the cube rose another centimeter, then stopped, still not fully open, but unmistakably yielding to Ellie's approach. Professor Quixx's translator emitted a sound that might have been a chuckle or a gasp. Ms. Washington, I believe you're actually going to succeed where generations of the galaxy's brightest minds have failed. The final phase of Ellie's solution unfolded with precision that belied its simplicity. As the tea continued its journey through the internal mechanisms of the container, she carefully rotated the cube to ensure the liquid reached all the necessary chambers. The internal structure uses hydraulic principles, she explained to the now captivated audience. The liquid creates pressure in specific chambers, which triggers the release mechanism. A series of soft clicks emanated from within the container as internal locks disengaged one by one. The top panel rose another centimeter, then another, revealing more of the intricate interior. Now for the final step, Ellie announced, reaching for the last of her tea. She poured a careful measure into a specific corner channel that had just been revealed. This completes the hydraulic circuit. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The top panel of the container rose smoothly and completely, accompanied by a harmonious tone that resonated throughout the lecture hall. Light spilled from within the now open cube, casting prismatic patterns across the faces of the astonished students. Professor Quixx's gelatinous form had become almost completely transparent, a state of academic ecstasy rarely witnessed even by his longtime colleagues. Extraordinary, he breathed through his translator. Inside the container, nestled on a bed of what appeared to be liquid crystal, sat a small data crystal and a handwritten note. Ellie carefully removed both, holding them up for the class to see. "What does it say?" asked Graxus, all 8 of his limbs trembling with anticipation. Ellie read the note aloud. "The universe rewards those who understand its fundamental nature. Complexity is often a veil for ignorance, while simplicity reveals true mastery." Professor Quixx extended a trembling appendage toward the data crystal. "May I?" Ellie handed it over, and the professor inserted it into his personal interface. His body flashed with rapid color changes as he processed the information. "This contains the complete solution and design specifications for the container," he announced. "And something else, a historical record." His voice modulator shifted to a tone of reverence. "This container was designed by Professor Quixx, my great progenitor, over 900 cycles ago." He turned to face Ellie, his form solidifying into a deep purplish hue. "The container was created specifically to test whether advanced civilizations remember the basic principles upon which all technology is built. It seems we have forgotten much in our race toward complexity." T'Pella stepped forward, her crystalline form glinting in the light from the open container. "I spent 3 cycles growing specialized molecular analysis structures," she admitted, "when all I needed was to understand thermal expansion. And I modified my telepathic nodes to detect quantum fluctuations," added Graxus, "when simple observation would have revealed the pattern." The Flobian twins deactivated their probability field generator with a sheepish gesture. "We calculated 17,000 possible combinations. When there was only one path dictated by universal constants," finished the other twin. Professor Quixx floated to the center of the room, his body now a calm, authoritative purple. "This is the true lesson of the challenge, students. Advanced technology and evolved capabilities are valuable tools, but they are extensions of fundamental principles, not replacements for understanding them." He turned to Ellie. "Ms. Washington, your grandfather's wisdom transcends planetary boundaries. The Galactic Academy has much to learn from Earth's pragmatic approach to problem-solving." 3 days later, Ellie found herself in the dean's private chambers, facing not only Professor Quixx, but also the Academy's highest officials. The dean, an ancient Telosian with iridescent scales and multifaceted eyes, regarded her with unmistakable respect. Ms. Washington, your solution to Professor Quixx's challenge has created quite a stir in our academic community, the dean said, her voice melodious and precise. We would like to offer you a special research position within our applied physics department, focusing on what we're tentatively calling fundamental approach methodologies. Ellie blinked in surprise. You want me to teach alien civilizations how to think simpler? Professor Quixx's body rippled with what she now recognized as amusement. Not simpler, Ms. Washington. More foundational. Your species' relatively recent technological development gives you a perspective that many of us have lost over millennia of advancement. You see connections between basic principles and practical applications that our students increasingly overlook, added the dean. This perspective is invaluable. One semester later, Professor Quixx and Ellie stood side by side at the entrance to a new lecture hall. Above the doorway, freshly inscribed in 17 different languages, was a quote from Ellie's grandfather, "Understand the simplest rules, and you'll never be stumped for long." Inside, students from across the galaxy, some with tentacles, some with crystalline bodies, some with multiple heads or no visible body at all, gathered around workstations equipped not with advanced technology, but with basic materials, heating elements, rolling compounds, simple levers, and hydraulic demonstrations. Welcome, announced Professor Quixx, his translator set to maximum clarity, to Fundamental Universal Principles 101. Your instructor today needs no introduction, but I shall provide one anyway. Professor Ellie Washington of Earth will be teaching this course, and I will be her assistant. He turned to Ellie, his gelatinous form glowing with a warm, respectful blue. The floor is yours, Professor Washington. Ellie stepped forward, surveying the diverse faces looking back at her with curiosity and anticipation. She thought of her grandfather, who had never left Earth, but whose wisdom now echoed across the stars. She smiled. Let's begin with a simple question, she said. What happens when something gets hot?